Lila Brooks stood in the penthouse office of Caldwell Enterprises, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. In front of her, on a gleaming ebony desk, lay the marriage contract, a thin sheet of paper, yet heavy as the world. The black ink words were sharp as blades ready to sever her future. She, a 24-year-old black American woman who once dreamed of a life of freedom, now stood at a crossroads with no exit sign. Her name, or watch her family collapse. Across from her stood Ethan Caldwell, the most intimidating white billionaire in the city. His icy blue eyes studied her without emotion, like a predator waiting for its prey to fall. The gray suit he wore was perfectly tailored, radiating power and distance. The vast office space with floor-to-ceiling glass windows showcased a sweeping view of the city below, a reminder that Ethan lived in a world far removed from people like Lila. "Sign it," Ethan said, his voice cold and sharp, slicing through the suffocating silence. "Your father's debt isn't going to disappear on its own." Lila gripped the expensive pen tightly, her hand trembling. She could smell Ethan's luxurious cologne, mingling with the crushing weight of her family's situation. Just 3 months ago, she'd been an accountant at a small firm in Harlem, working tirelessly to save money for her mother Grace, who was battling lung cancer. Lila had once dreamed of becoming a social worker helping families like hers. But that dream now felt distant, buried under the debt her father James had created. James had once been a talented chef and the proud owner of Soul Haven, a restaurant passed down through 3 generations of the Brooks family. The little Harlem eatery filled with the scent of cornbread and the sound of jazz was where Lila grew up, learned to mix the batter, and listened to her mother's stories of their ancestors. But James had a gambling addiction, and the games had taken everything. The restaurant was seized, the family home mortgaged, and Grace's medical bills piled up like an insurmountable mountain. Worse, James had borrowed from loan sharks, men who didn't hesitate to use violence to collect debts. Lila looked down at the contract, her heart tightening. A month ago, Ethan's lawyers had approached her father with an offer that sounded like a miracle erase all debts, pay for Grace's treatment, and cover her younger brother Malik's college tuition. In exchange, Lila would marry Ethan. James had said this was the only chance, his eyes full of guilt and desperation. Lila had screamed at him, called him selfish, but when she saw her mother lying in bed too weak to sit up, she knew she had no choice. "I need time to think," Lila whispered, her voice so small the cavernous space nearly swallowed it. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze unflinching. "You have 30 seconds. Your father signed the preliminary agreement yesterday. This is just a formality." His words hit her like a punch to the chest. Her father had sold her without asking, without giving her a chance to decide. She thought of her mother, who always smiled through pain, who always told her, "You are my hope, Lila." She thought of Malik, her 19-year-old brother studying pre-med and dreaming of becoming a doctor. She thought of the debt notice taped to their front door and the threatening calls from unknown men. If she refused, her family would lose everything, maybe even their lives. "What will this marriage be like?" Lila asked, her voice trembling, but laced with a hint of defiance. She hated herself for seeming weak, but needed to know what she was stepping into. Ethan raised an eyebrow, as if her question amused him. "A business arrangement," he replied without hesitation. "You'll live in my house, attend social events as my wife, and maintain the image of a happy marriage. In return, your family's debts are cleared, your mother receives the best medical care, and your brother stays in college." "What about love?" Lila blurted out, instantly regretting the naive question. Ethan scoffed, but his smile held no warmth. "Love is a luxury neither of us can afford. I need a wife for business purposes. You need financial security. It's a fair trade." Lila looked around the office, searching for some sign of humanity in Ethan. The framed diplomas and awards on the wall testified to his success, but there were no family photos, no personal items, nothing that showed he had ever cared for anyone but himself. She wondered what had turned someone into this wall of ice, but the harsh reality quickly replaced that question. "How long is the contract?" she asked, her voice steadier. 5 years, Ethan replied. "After that, we can discuss renewal or termination." Renewal or termination. As if she were an employee, not a person. As if this marriage was just another task on his agenda. Anger surged in Lila, but she held it in thinking of her mother Malik and the dreams she once had. "And if I refuse?" she said, locking eyes with Ethan. His face didn't change, but a dangerous glint sparked in his eyes. "Your father's other creditors aren't as patient as I am. Some of them have creative methods of collecting." The threat hung between them. Lila knew her father had borrowed from dangerous men loan sharks who wouldn't hesitate to beat, or worse, to get their money back. She had seen him tremble every time the doorbell rang unexpectedly and heard him whisper to her mother about people you don't cross. That fear now transferred to her, squeezing her heart. "You're coercing me," Lila said, her voice now stronger, though inside she was breaking. "I'm offering you a solution." Ethan corrected his tone, disturbingly calm, a generous one. Most women would consider themselves lucky to marry Ethan Caldwell. "Most women haven't met you," Lila snapped, unable to hide the bitterness. Ethan tilted his head slightly, something maybe amusement flickering across his face. "Careful, Miss Brooks. I don't tolerate disrespect. And I don't tolerate being treated like property." Lila shot back, her eyes blazing. They stared at each other, two people from two different worlds, bound by a circumstance neither had chosen. Ethan Caldwell was everything Lila despised. Arrogant, cold, and so wealthy he believed money could buy anything, even a wife. But he was also her family's only hope. Ethan said the wedding would be in 2 weeks, as if her consent had already been given. "My assistant will handle the details. You'll move into my house right after the ceremony." Lila picked up the pen again, its weight now feeling like the weight of her fate. She thought of her mother's smile and how she always spoke about Lila's future with such fierce belief. She considered Malik's dream to become a doctor and save lives. She thought of her father's shame and fear of the debt collectors. And then she thought of herself, a girl who once believed she could change the world, now forced to give up everything to save the people she loved. "Will you be kind to me?" Lila asked, her voice soft but resolute. Ethan was silent for a long moment, his eyes seeming to consider something. "I'll try not to be cruel," he said at last. It wasn't a promise, but it was all she would get. Lila took a deep breath and signed her name on the contract. The ink bled into the paper, marking the beginning of a new life she didn't choose, but would have to live. In 2 weeks, she would become Mrs. Caldwell, the wife of a man who saw her as just another item in his collection. As she set the pen down, Ethan stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "My driver will take you home. Pack lightly. You won't need much from your old life." "What do you mean?" Lila asked, her voice sharp. Ethan didn't turn around, but his voice was glacial. "I mean, the life you knew is over. Welcome to my world." 2 weeks after signing the contract, Lila Brooks stood at the entrance of St. Augustine Church, her heart heavy as lead. Tailored to perfection, the white silk wedding dress hugged her body and shimmered under the chandelier's glow, but it brought no happiness. Instead, it felt like a beautiful cage trapping her in a future that didn't belong to her. Lila, a 24-year-old Black American woman who once dreamed of a wedding filled with laughter and love, now felt like she was stepping into a tomb. Her father, James, stood beside her, holding her hand. His eyes were red, filled with guilt, but he said nothing. Lila recalled confronting him after discovering he had signed the agreement with Ethan Caldwell without asking her. "I had no choice, Lila," he had said, his voice trembling. "They would have killed us if I disagreed." Lila had turned away, tears streaming down her face, unable to forgive and abandon him. As he walked her down the aisle, each step grew heavier under the weight of that betrayal. The grand church with intricately carved wooden pews was filled with people, but none were Lila's friends or family. The guests, dressed in expensive suits and gowns, were business partners, investors, and Ethan Caldwell's elite circle members. They came to witness the wedding of one of the city's most powerful billionaires, not to bless her union. In the front row, her mother, Grace, sat in a wheelchair, her face pale, but trying to smile. Beside her was Malik, Lila's younger brother, who had just flown in from university. That was all. She had a small sliver of family in a sea of strangers. Ethan stood at the altar, handsome, in a black tuxedo, his blonde hair neatly combed. His icy blue eyes fixed on her as she approached, but there was no smile, no warmth. He looked like he was attending a board meeting, not his wedding. Lila felt her chest tighten. This was not the dream she'd once had as a little girl, sitting in the kitchen of Soul Haven, listening to her mother tell stories about the love between her and her father. The ceremony passed like a hazy dream. Lila heard herself repeating the vows, promising to love and honor a man she barely knew. When it came time to exchange rings, Ethan slid the cold diamond band onto her finger, his touch grazing her skin without a hint of tenderness. The wedding kiss was colder still, a brief mechanical press of lips, as if checking off a box. The priest declared, "You are now husband and wife," but Lila only felt an empty void inside. The reception was held at the city's most luxurious hotel, with silk-draped tables and glittering crystal chandeliers. Lila sat beside Ethan at the head table, forcing a smile whenever a camera was pointed their way. She felt like an actress in a play she never auditioned for. Ethan placed a hand on hers every so often, but it was all for the show for the paparazzi. He didn't speak to her, didn't look at her, only focused on conversations with guests, men in expensive suits, talking about stocks and mergers. Lila scanned the room, hoping to spot a familiar face. Her mother, though frail, had stayed for a while. Grace held her hand and whispered, "You didn't have to do this, baby." But both of them knew that was a lie. If Lila hadn't signed that contract, her mother wouldn't have received treatment. Malik would have lost his scholarship, and the loan sharks wouldn't have stopped. Lila squeezed her mother's hand and said, "I'm okay, Mom. You should rest now." But as the nurse wheeled Grace back to the hospital, Lila felt like she'd been left alone on a deserted island. Malik came to her side, his eyes filled with concern. "Lila, how does he treat you?" he asked in a low voice so no one else could hear. Lila looked at her brother, the one who had always been her source of strength, and lied. "He's not awful, Malik. Just different from us." Malik frowned, clearly unconvinced, but didn't push. "If you ever need me, call. I'll leave school if I have to." Lila smiled, touched and heartbroken. "Just keep studying, future doctor. I'll be fine." As Malik left to catch his flight back to school, Lila felt truly alone. She looked at Ethan, chatting with a group of businessmen, his smile flawless but insincere. He was her husband in name, but between them stood only a contract. Lila thought of the old days gathering with friends in Harlem, laughing and dreaming of the future. Now those friends were far away, unable to understand her life. She was Mrs. Caldwell, but she still felt like Lila, just a Harlem girl, trapped in a world that didn't belong to her. A well-dressed, middle-aged woman approached. "Congratulations, Mrs. Caldwell," the woman said sweetly, though her eyes were inquisitive. "I'm Eleanor Hayes, an old friend of Ethan's. It was quite a surprise to hear he got married." He always said he'd never marry for love. Lila stiffened, forcing a smile. "Thank you," she replied, unsure what else to say. Eleanor smiled, but her gaze seemed to assess Lila as if she were an ill-fitting ornament in Ethan's collection. Ethan appeared beside Lila, interrupting the conversation. "Eleanor, thank you for coming," he said, his voice polite but cold. He placed a hand on Lila's back and guided her away. "Be careful with her," he murmured. "She likes to stir up trouble." Lila nodded, but inside, she wondered how many old friends like Eleanor had there been, and to Ethan was she anything more than a contract. The reception dragged late into the night, but Lila felt detached. She smiled when needed and nodded when spoken to, but her mind wandered. She remembered nights at Soul Haven when her father sang old jazz tunes and her mother's laughter filled the air. She remembered Malik teasing her and calling her the serious big sister. Those memories now felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Finally, when the guests began to leave, Ethan came to her. "It's time," he said flatly, to go where Lila asked, though she already knew. "Home. Our home," Ethan replied, but the word "our" rang hollow. Lila looked around, hoping to see her mother or Malik, but they were gone. All she had now was Ethan the stranger, who had just become her husband. As they stepped out of the hotel, camera flashes lit up the night. Ethan held her hand, but there was no warmth in his grip. Lila gazed out at the sparkling city through the car window, feeling like she was leaving behind. This wedding wasn't the beginning of a new life. It was the door closing on her old one. She was Mrs. Caldwell, but in her heart, she was still Lila Brooks, a Harlem girl forced to play a role she never chose. Lila Brooks woke up in the vast bedroom, early morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting soft beams across the king-size bed covered in silk sheets. But the comfort of the bed couldn't soothe the emptiness inside her. It was her first day living in Ethan Caldwell's mansion, her new home, yet it felt nothing like one. Lila, a 24-year-old Black American woman, once used to a small Harlem apartment filled with laughter and the smell of baked cornbread, now felt like a stranger in her own life. She stepped out of bed, her feet touching the cold marble floor. The silk robe hanging in the closet, a piece chosen by Ethan's assistant, reminded her that even her clothes were no longer her choice. Lila looked around the room, luxurious furniture and expensive paintings on the walls, but no trace of personality or life. It looked more like a magazine spread than a place to live. Ethan's mansion sat in the city's most exclusive district, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. Lila walked down a long hallway, surprised by the silence that blanketed everything. In Harlem, she was used to children playing in the street, jazz music drifting from her family's Soul Haven restaurant, and her mother, Grace, humming an old tune. Here, there was only the echo of her footsteps. Mrs. Clara, the housekeeper, about 60 years old, appeared with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," she said softly. Lila flinched at the new title. "Just call me Lila." "Mrs. Clara," she replied, trying to mask her discomfort. Clara nodded, her eyes filled with quiet sympathy, as if she understood Lila's trapped feelings. Mrs. Clara led her to the breakfast room, where a small table had been set coffee toast and fresh fruit. "Mr. Caldwell left early," Clara said as Lila sat down. "He usually leaves before sunrise and returns late. You'll rarely see him." Lila nodded, unsurprised. Ethan had made it clear on the day they signed the contract. "This is a business arrangement. You have your space. I have mine." Still, his absence left her feeling abandoned. Lila sipped her coffee, her mind drifting back to Harlem. She remembered helping her father James in the evenings at the restaurant, where he taught her how to season black-eyed pea soup. She remembered her mother telling stories of ancestors who had endured hardship to build a life in America. Those memories now felt like distant dreams replaced by the cold reality of this mansion. Lila wondered if she could ever find herself again, or if she would forever be Mrs. Caldwell, a role she was forced to play. "Are you all right, Lila?" Clara asked, pulling her out of her thoughts. Lila forced a smile. "Just trying to adjust." Clara placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, one of the few kind gestures Lila had felt in days. "You'll find your way. You're stronger than you think." Lila wanted to believe her, but the loneliness was suffocating. After breakfast, Lila decided to explore the mansion. She wandered through impeccably arranged rooms, a library filled with thousands of books, a state-of-the-art gym, and a private home theater. But there were no family photos or personal items. Nothing hinting Ethan was a man with feelings. That intrigued her. What was Ethan Caldwell, the powerful billionaire, hiding? What had turned him into the wall of ice she met in his office? She stopped in front of a second-floor oak door, different from the others because it was locked. Lila touched the handle, curious, but it wouldn't budge. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Clara, her expression uneasy. "That's Mr. Caldwell's private room," Clara said. "He doesn't let anyone in." "Not even me." Lila nodded, but the mystery of the room clung to her mind. Was it the key to understanding Ethan? That afternoon, Lila called her mother. Grace's voice was weak but full of hope. "I'm doing better thanks to you," she said, referring to the money Ethan had paid for her cancer treatment. "But Lila, how are you? That man, how is he treating you?" Lila hesitated. She wanted to tell the truth that Ethan was cold, that she felt like a prisoner, but she didn't want her mother to worry. "He's swamped, Mom," she said. "But I'm okay. Please focus on getting better." Grace sighed. "You've always been strong, Lila. But don't forget who you are." After the call, Lila sat by the window gazing at the garden. She thought of Malik, her younger brother, now studying medicine far away. She remembered how he teased her, calling her the strict big sister for constantly reminding him to do his homework. Malik was the family's hope, and Lila had given up her freedom so he could keep chasing his dream. But the cost was beginning to crush her. She wondered if she could survive this marriage without losing herself. Suddenly, Lila's phone vibrated. An unknown number flashed on the screen. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Brooks." A deep, threatening male voice said, "Your father still owes us. The deal with Caldwell doesn't erase this debt. If you don't pay, your family will." Lila's heart dropped. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Money or blood? You choose." The call ended, leaving her in fear. She had thought Ethan's contract settled everything. Now she realized her family's past was still hunting them. Lila stood up and walked the hallway, searching for comfort in this unfamiliar space. She stopped in front of a large mirror and stared at her reflection. Natural curls, deep brown eyes, and dark glowing skin were all her, yet she felt like she was disappearing. She was Lila Brooks, the girl who once dreamed of changing the world, but now she was Mrs. Caldwell, part of a bargain she never wanted. That night, Ethan returned home late. Lila heard his footsteps in the hallway, but he didn't come into her room. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the locked door and the threatening voice on the phone. Ethan was her husband, but he was also a stranger. She wondered if he would ever let her into his world, or if she would forever be an outsider in this house. Lila closed her eyes, silently vowing that no matter what, she would not let this house or Ethan destroy who she truly was. Lila Brooks sat at the breakfast table in Ethan Caldwell's mansion, the coffee cup in her hand, slowly growing cold. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, lighting up the tastefully decorated dining room, but it couldn't chase away the loneliness suffocating her. It had been a week since she moved in, becoming Mrs. Caldwell, a name that still felt foreign, something that didn't belong to her. Lila, a 24-year-old Black American woman raised in the warmth of Harlem, now felt completely adrift in Ethan's cold world. But today, sitting alone, she let her mind drift back to the past, a place where she could still find strength. She closed her eyes and memories returned like an old film reel. Lila remembered the afternoons at Soul Haven, the family restaurant that had been the Brooks legacy for 3 generations. The small Harlem eatery sat on a street corner with a wooden sign carved in gold letters and the irresistible smell of cornbread wafting from inside. Her father, James, was a gifted chef, always humming old jazz tunes as he stirred his signature black-eyed pea soup. Her mother, Grace, was the heart of the place, greeting customers with a radiant smile and stories of their ancestors, people who had survived slavery and segregation to build a life in America. Lila, then just a little girl, loved sitting on the counter watching her father mix the dough and listening to her mother talk about her great-great-grandfather who opened the restaurant with only 2 hands and a dream. "What will you be when you grow up?" Lila Grace would often ask, her eyes sparkling. Lila always answered, "I want to help people like you do." She dreamed of becoming a social worker, helping struggling families overcome hardship. Grace would nod and say, "You have a big heart, Lila. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." Those words echoed in her mind now, but they also carried pain. That big heart had brought her here, bound by a marriage contract, sacrificing herself to save her family. Lila's past wasn't only filled with joy. She remembered the nights her father came home late, his eyes red from gambling losses. James had once been strong and proud, but addiction had turned him into a shadow of himself. Lila had seen her mother cry in the kitchen, begging him to stop, but James would always promise, "Just one more time, Grace. I'll win it all back." But he never did. Soul Haven was seized. The family home was mortgaged. And when Grace was diagnosed with lung cancer, the medical bills stacked up like a mountain. At the time, Lila worked as an accountant at a small firm, trying to save every penny, but it was never enough. Her dream of grad school and working for a nonprofit dissolved, replaced by a constant fear for her mother and younger brother Malik. Malik had been the light in those dark days. 5 years younger, smart, and fiercely determined. When he received a scholarship to medical school, he hugged Lila and cried, promising he'd become a doctor to save people like their mother. Lila had always been proud of him, teasingly calling him the future doctor. But the scholarship didn't cover everything, and without the marriage contract with Ethan, Malik would have had to drop out. Thinking of him, Lila felt her decision, painful as it was, had been right. But the price she paid still crushed her. Lila set the coffee cup down and gazed out the window toward the garden. She thought about the threatening phone call from the week before, the cold voice of a stranger, "Miss Brooks, your father still owes us. If you don't pay, your family will." The fear from that call still clung to her like a shadow. She hadn't told Ethan she wasn't sure how he'd react. He was her husband on paper, but they lacked trust. Lila wondered whether she should confide in him or keep the secret to protect her family. Mrs. Clara, the housekeeper, entered and interrupted her thoughts. "Would you like me to prepare anything special for lunch?" she asked gently. Lila shook her head. "Thank you, but I'm not very hungry." Clara looked at her with quiet empathy. "Miss Lila, living here isn't easy, but you'll find your way. You have a strength Mr. Caldwell doesn't." Lila gave a faint smile, unsure whether she believed it. But Clara's kindness was the only warmth in this otherwise frozen house. After breakfast, Lila decided to call Malik. She needed to hear his voice to be reminded she wasn't alone. Malik answered immediately, his voice full of energy. "Lila, I just finished a biochem exam. It was brutal, but I did all right." Lila laughed the first time she'd felt light all day. Good job, future doctor. Just don't wear yourself out. Okay. Malik hesitated, then asked, Are you okay, sis? I mean, living with that man? Lila bit her lip, not wanting to worry him. I'm fine, Malik. Just adjusting to the new life. Ethan. He's busy, so I have plenty of time alone. Malik was quiet for a moment, then whispered, You don't have to lie to me. If he ever does anything wrong, I'll come home right away. Lila was touched, but she said, Just focus on your studies. I can handle it. But after she hung up, she wasn't so sure. Lila stood and walked to the window, staring at the distant city skyline. She thought of her mother now recovering thanks to Ethan's treatment money. Grace had called yesterday, her voice stronger. I'll be home soon, Lila. All thanks to you. But Lila knew the cost of that recovery, her freedom and dreams. She was torn. One part of her wanted to rebel against being Mrs. Caldwell. Another part knew she had to endure for her family's sake. She couldn't let her mother or Malik get hurt. She couldn't let the debt collectors get close. Suddenly, Lila heard a car pulling up in front of the mansion. She looked out the window and saw Ethan stepping out of his black sedan, wearing his perfectly tailored gray suit as always. He was home early. Unusual. Lila's heart began to race. She thought about the threatening call. Should she tell him Ethan was cold? But he had promised not to be cruel. Maybe he would help. Or perhaps he'd see her as just another problem to solve. As Ethan entered the house, Lila stood in the hallway gathering her courage. You're home early, she said, her voice calm despite her nerves. Ethan looked at her, his icy blue eyes unreadable. I forgot some documents, he replied flatly. He walked past her toward his office, then paused. Are you all right? You look uneasy. Lila was surprised by the question, but she shook her head. I'm just still adjusting to this place. Ethan nodded, but didn't press. You'll adjust. This is your home now. He continued walking, leaving Lila with a strange mix of relief and disappointment. She wanted to tell him about the threat, wanted to chip away at the wall between them, but she didn't know how. Lila returned to her room, deciding that she would face her fear alone for now. But deep inside, she knew she couldn't keep running forever. She was Lila Brooks, and though trapped in this house, she would find a way to hold on to who she was. Lila Brooks stood before the locked oak door on the second floor of Ethan Caldwell's mansion, her heart pounding. It had been 2 weeks since she moved in, and this room, the one that Mrs. Clara, the housekeeper, had called private, still haunted her. Lila, a 24-year-old Black American woman raised in the warmth and openness of Harlem, found the mystery of the room to be a challenge, a puzzle demanding to be solved. It was her only clue to Ethan's authentic self, her husband in name, only a man she knew only through icy stares and clipped sentences. She touched the doorknob, knowing it wouldn't budge, but still tried. It remained motionless, a barrier between her and Ethan's hidden world. Lila sighed and turned away, but her curiosity only grew. Ethan Caldwell, the powerful billionaire with glacial blue eyes, was a riddle she was determined to crack. What had made him so distant? What was he hiding behind this door? That morning, Lila sat in the mansion's library, a room full of books, but lacking warmth. She held a business book, which Ethan seemed to like, but her mind wandered. She kept thinking about the threatening phone call from the week before, the cold voice saying, "Your father still owes us. If you don't pay, your family will." The fear from that call still clung to her, stopping her from telling Ethan. She wasn't sure he'd care. Would he see it as just another problem to handle? Like any business deal, Mrs. Clara entered, carrying a tray of tea. "You look tired, Miss Lila," she said kindly. Lila gave a faint smile. "I'm just trying to understand this place." And Mr. Caldwell. Clara set the tray down, her eyes flickering with hesitation. He's a complicated man. But he hasn't always been as cold as he seems. Lila tilted her head, intrigued. What do you mean? Clara sat across from her, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might overhear. That room upstairs holds things from his family, his parents. Mr. Caldwell never talks about them, but I know he keeps mementos in there. It's where he keeps his heart, if I may say so. Lila's heartbeat quickened. His parents. What happened to them? Clara shook her head. It's not my place to say. But Miss Lila, you'll need patience if you want to understand him. He's lost more than you know. Clara's words stirred something in Lila. After the housekeeper left, Lila opened her laptop, one of the few personal items she'd brought from her old life, and began searching for information about Ethan Caldwell. She scrolled through articles praising him, the city's youngest billionaire, the man who saved Caldwell Enterprises from collapse. But then she stumbled upon an older article about Ethan's father, William Caldwell, buried deep in the search results. William had once been a successful entrepreneur building Caldwell Enterprises from the ground up. But he made mistakes investing in failing companies out of compassion and trusting partners who betrayed him. The company nearly collapsed, and William died of a stroke at 52, leaving Ethan, then only 22, to pick up the wreckage. Another article mentioned Ethan's mother, Eleanor, a gifted painter who had died of heart disease when Ethan was still a child. Lila felt her chest tighten. Ethan had lost both parents, and those losses seemed to have carved him into the cold, distant man she now lived with. Lila closed her laptop, her mind spinning. She thought about her own life, how her mother's illness and her father's failures had shaped her. She knew what loss felt like, but she had chosen to keep her heart open. Ethan had locked his away. That secret room might be where he kept what was left of his true self, the part he didn't want anyone to see. That evening, Lila decided to confront Ethan. He came home earlier than usual, which was rare. She found him in his office, sitting behind his desk, the computer screen's glow illuminating his face. "We need to talk," Lila said from the doorway, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan looked up, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" Lila took a deep breath. "About the call last week. One of my father's creditors reached out. They said our contract doesn't cancel his debt. They threatened my family." She watched him, waiting for a reaction. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes sharpened. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice low but laced with tension. "I didn't think you'd care," Lila replied, her voice tinged with challenge. Ethan stood and approached her, prompting her to step back instinctively. "You're my wife, Lila. If someone threatens you, they threaten me. I'll take care of it." He turned and picked up his phone. "David, I need the security team to investigate a creditor. I'll send the details shortly." He hung up and looked at her. "From now on, if anything like that happens, you come to me." "Understood." Lila nodded, surprised by his decisiveness. But she didn't stop there. "And I want to know about the room upstairs. Why is it locked? What's inside?" Ethan tensed, his gaze darkening. "That's none of your business." Lila stepped forward, refusing to back down. "I'm your wife, Ethan. If you expect me to play this role, at least let me understand you." Ethan studied her for a long moment, as if weighing a decision. Then he sighed, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a key. "Follow me," he said quietly. Lila followed him up the stairs, her heart pounding. Ethan unlocked the door, and the room unfolded before her. Unlike the rest of the mansion, this space was alive with feeling. The walls were covered with photographs, Ethan as a child, beaming beside a man who looked just like him, likely William. Another picture showed a graceful woman with a gentle smile, Eleanor, his mother. In one corner stood an easel holding an unfinished painting of a vivid seascape. "Is that your mother?" Lila asked, pointing to the photograph. Ethan nodded, his voice hoarse. "She died when I was 10. She was a painter. She taught me to draw." Lila touched the edge of the easel, sensing the sorrow in his words. "And your father?" she asked. Ethan turned away, looking out the window. "He built everything. Then they destroyed it. He trusted the wrong people. He was too soft. I can't be like him." Lila stepped closer. "Caring isn't a weakness, Ethan. It's how you survive the loss." Ethan didn't respond, but there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes. He locked the door again and said, "Don't come back here. And don't tell anyone." Lila nodded, but inside another door had opened. A door to the honest Ethan Caldwell. Lila Brooks stood by the bedroom window in Ethan Caldwell's mansion, the glittering city lights in the distance, unable to quiet the unrest within her. It had been 3 weeks since she became Mrs. Caldwell, and though she had uncovered part of Ethan's past through the secret room, the threat from her father's creditors still loomed like a shadow. Lila, a 24-year-old black woman raised in the warmth of Harlem, now felt trapped between two worlds. On one side, a cold, calculated marriage. On the other, a dangerous family past. That morning, Lila received a message from an unknown number. "Miss Brooks, time's almost up. $50,000, or your mother won't live to see tomorrow." Her heart dropped. She remembered the chilling voice from the earlier phone call threatening her family over a debt her father James had failed to pay. She had told Ethan, and he had promised to handle it, but this message made it clear the danger hadn't passed. Lila gripped her phone, torn between wanting to solve the problem and fear gnawing at her for Grace and Malik. She found Mrs. Clara, the housekeeper, in the kitchen. "Mrs. Clara, I need to go out for a bit," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Clara looked at her with concern. "Are you all right, Miss Lila? You look pale." Lila forced a smile. "I need to visit my mother. She's still in the hospital." Clara nodded, though her eyes asked more than her lips did. "Be careful, dear. If you need anything, say the word." Lila went to the hospital, where Grace was receiving treatment for lung cancer. Her mother lay in bed, her face pale, but her eyes lighting up when she saw her. "Lila, you came." Grace said, her voice weak but warm. Lila sat down and held her mother's hand, feeling how fragile she was. "How are you?" "What did the doctors say?" she asked. Grace smiled. "Better, thanks to you. They say I could be home in a few weeks." Lila nodded, but the dread from the threatening message surged again. "Mom, I need to ask, did Dad ever tell you who he borrowed money from?" Grace's brow furrowed, pain flickering in her eyes. "You know your father made mistakes, Lila. He owed money to dangerous people, but you signed the contract with Mr. Caldwell. Wasn't that supposed to fix everything?" Lila shook her head and told her about the message. Grace gripped her hand, her voice trembling. "Lila, you can't get involved in this. These men, they have no mercy. Tell your husband." Lila left the hospital, her thoughts in turmoil. She didn't want to rely on Ethan, who kept his distance despite showing her his secret room. But Grace was right. She couldn't handle this alone. When she returned to the mansion, Lila found Ethan in his office reviewing documents. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Where have you been?" he asked, voice neutral but faintly curious. Lila took a deep breath and stepped inside. "I got another message from one of my father's creditors. They want $50,000 or they'll hurt my mom." She handed him her phone, her heart racing. Ethan read the message, his face unchanged, but his eyes sharpened like blades. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Because I didn't want to be a burden. I've already dragged you into enough, Lila replied, her voice tinged with frustration. Ethan stood and walked toward her. You are my wife, Lila. Threatening you is threatening me. Don't you understand? That Lila stared at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. So what will you do? She asked. Ethan picked up his phone and called his assistant. David, I need the security team to trace a phone number and arrange protection for Mrs. Grace Brooks at the hospital. Immediately. He hung up and looked at her. From now on, you won't go anywhere alone. Understood? Lila nodded, a swirl of emotion rising in her chest. She was grateful for Ethan's quick action, but his control made her feel even more confined. Thank you, she said quietly. But I don't want to live like a prisoner. Ethan looked at her, his expression softening slightly. I don't want you in danger, he said, voice low. It's not a prison. It's protection. Lila turned and walked back to her room, her mind spinning. She thought about Ethan's past, what she had learned from the secret room. His mother Eleanor died when he was a child. His father William collapsed under pressure after nearly destroying the company. Ethan had learned to close his heart to survive. And yet his efforts to protect her family showed he wasn't completely unfeeling. Lila wondered if she could reach that part of him, or if they would always be strangers under the same roof. That evening, Lila called Malik. His voice was tight and concerned after hearing about the threat. Let me come home, Lila. I can help, he said, but Lila cut him off. No, Malik. Stay in school. Ethan's handling it. I don't want you involved. Malik sighed. You always protect me, Lila. But who protects you? The question left her speechless. She lied saying she was fine, but after hanging up, she felt more alone than ever. Lila stood in front of the mirror staring at her reflection. Her natural curls, deep brown eyes, and rich dark skin. She was still Lila Brooks, even with the Caldwell name. She dreamed of becoming a social worker and helping families like hers. The creditor's threat reminded her how important that dream still was. She vowed that, contract or not, she would find a way to protect her family and hold on to who she was. That night, Lila heard footsteps in the hallway. She opened the door and saw Ethan standing there holding a folder. I just got the report from security, he said. They've identified the one who sent the message. A loan shark named Marcus Reed. He won't bother you again. Lila stared at him. How did you manage that? Ethan shrugged. Money and power solve a lot of things. He paused, then added, but Lila, next time trust me. We're a team, even if only on paper. Lila nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Ethan turned to go, but his words, a team, echoed in her chest. She closed her eyes and thought of the secret room of the man Ethan kept hidden. Maybe behind all his walls of ice, a heart still beat. And maybe, just maybe, she could find her way to it. Lila Brooks stood in front of the bedroom mirror, the black evening gown hugging her figure and accentuating her rich dark skin. It had been a month since she became Mrs. Caldwell, and tonight was the first time she would appear as Ethan Caldwell's wife at a social event. The upscale business dinner at the city's most luxurious restaurant was Ethan's chance to introduce her to key partners. Still Lila, a 24-year-old black woman raised in the warmth of Harlem, felt as though she were walking into an arena. She wasn't just expected to play the perfect wife. She also had to confront herself. Could she hold on to her identity? In Ethan's cold world, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his black tuxedo sharp and his ice blue eyes sharper. Are you ready? He asked, his voice neutral, but laced with a subtle appraisal. Lila nodded, though anxiety coiled in her chest. She remembered her mother Grace's words during their morning phone call. You are Lila Brooks, my daughter. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Lila clenched her fist, slightly determined not to let Ethan's world consume her. Le Ciel. The restaurant sat on the top floor of a high-rise offering a panoramic view of the glittering city below. Lila walked in beside Ethan, her hand resting lightly on his arm, though their physical connection was purely performative. Round tables covered in white silk tablecloths shimmered under crystal chandeliers with polished silverware and delicate wine glasses. Guests, business moguls, investors, and a few power players watched her with a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Ethan introduced her. This is my wife, Lila Caldwell. The word wife echoed strangely in her ears, like a label that didn't belong to her. Lila sat beside Ethan, forcing polite smiles as the questions came. How did you two meet? How are you enjoying life as Mrs. Caldwell? She gave vague answers, avoiding specifics they'd never agreed on a backstory. Ethan, in contrast, lied smoothly. We met at a charity event. I knew right away she was someone special. Lila glanced at him, surprised by the ease of his fabrication, but said nothing. The conversation shifted to business, and Lila felt like an outsider. The guests discussed profits, stock movements, and a new Caldwell Enterprises venture. Richard Langston, a major investor, asked Ethan, "You're planning to shut down the Rochester plant. It's bleeding money." Ethan nodded. Yes, closing it is the only viable option. We need to cut losses and redirect investment. Lila tensed. She remembered when Soul Haven closed, leaving dozens jobless. She thought about the families depending on the Rochester plant families, about to lose everything just before winter. She couldn't stay silent. How many people will be affected by the closure, she asked. The table went quiet, eyes turning toward her. Ethan squeezed her hand under the table, a silent warning. Richard chuckled, as if her question were quaint. About 300 workers. But that's the cost of doing business, Mrs. Caldwell. Lila's blood boiled. That's 300 families, she said firmly. Isn't there another way? Relocate the plant. Invest in improvements. Richard raised an eyebrow while Ethan leaned in to whisper, Lila, that's enough. But she didn't stop. I understand the need for profit, but these people have children and bills to pay. Isn't there a more humane solution? Tension tightened around the table. Some guests exchanged looks as though Lila had committed an unforgivable breach. Ethan forced a strained smile. My wife cares deeply about people. We'll discuss it further later. The conversation shifted, but Lila could feel Ethan's gaze burning into her. On the ride home, the silence was thick. Ethan drove with eyes fixed on the road, but his voice was icy. What exactly were you doing back there? Undermining me in front of investors? Lila turned to him, unwavering. I'm not a doll for display, Ethan. I have a voice and use it when I see something wrong. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter. You embarrassed me. Richard is my biggest investor, and I embarrassed you because I care about people, she replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. Do you ever think about those families, or just the numbers? Ethan said nothing, but his expression wavered. You don't understand business, Lila. Feelings don't pay the bills. She looked out the window. Maybe not. But without feelings, what's left to live for? When they returned to the mansion, Ethan disappeared into his office, and Lila retreated to her room. She sat by the window thinking of Harlem, of helping her father James at Soul Haven. She thought of her mother Grace, who always taught her to stand up for what was right. Lila knew she had taken a risk challenging Ethan, but she didn't regret it. She called Malik, needing to hear his voice to steady herself. Are you okay? Malik asked as soon as he picked up. Lila told him about the dinner, her tone laced with frustration and weariness. I just wanted to do what was right, Malik. But Ethan, he doesn't understand. Malik sighed. You've always fought for others, Lila. Just don't forget to fight for yourself. He may be your husband, but you don't belong to him. His words struck a chord. Lila promised she'd be careful, but her resolve was stronger than ever when the call ended. The next morning, Lila found a note from Ethan on the dining table. I've instructed the team to review relocating the Rochester plant. Don't misunderstand. This is a business decision, not an emotional one. Lila held the note, her heart pounding. He wouldn't admit it, but his actions said enough. He had listened. She thought of the secret room of the man Ethan tried to keep hidden. Maybe beneath all his ice there was still a flicker of warmth, and Lila was more determined than ever to reach it. Lila Brooks sat in the library of Ethan Caldwell's mansion, the light from the desk lamp casting a warm glow across pages of dense handwritten notes. It had been 6 weeks since she became Mrs. Caldwell. In that time, she had found a flicker of light. Amid the loneliness, the idea for the Hope Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping families facing medical crises. Lila, a 24-year-old black woman who once dreamed of becoming a social worker in Harlem, was determined to make that dream real, despite being bound to a cold marriage contract with Ethan. The inspiration for the Hope Foundation came from her own life. She thought of her mother, Grace, who nearly died from lung cancer because they couldn't afford treatment. She thought of families like hers, forced into unbearable choices, save a loved one or keep their home. Lila wanted to ensure no one else would ever face that pain. She had spent hours researching, contacting charitable organizations, and drafting her proposal. But to make the Hope Foundation a reality, she needed funding, which meant facing Ethan. Lila approached Ethan in his office one evening, just after he returned from the company. He sat behind his desk, the light from the computer screen casting sharp shadows across his face, making his ice-blue eyes even more piercing. "We need to talk," Lila said, standing in the doorway, her voice firm despite her racing heart. Ethan looked up, raising an eyebrow. "About what, another creditor?" Lila shook her head and stepped inside, placing a folder on his desk. "About a project of mine, the Hope Foundation." Ethan glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. "The Hope Foundation," he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. Lila took a deep breath and began. "It's a non-profit that helps families who can't afford medical care. I want to support them with hospital bills, medication, and even tuition for their children. You might think it's sentimental, but I have a structured plan. I need seed funding, and I'm asking for your help." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you want me to pour money into a charity? Right after I handled the Rochester plant debacle, because of your humanitarian idea?" Lila felt a surge of heat rises in her chest, but kept her composure. "This isn't just charity, Ethan. It's an investment in people. You saw what happened to my family because of medical debt. I don't want anyone else to go through that." Ethan remained silent, flipping through her proposal. Lila watched him, wondering if he could see the value in her vision. She thought of the secret room he once let her into, his mother's unfinished painting, the photographs, the pieces of a man not entirely feeling. He had protected her family from loan sharks and had considered relocating the Rochester plant. There was a heart under all that ice, but the wall around it remained. Finally, Ethan looked up. "I'll fund $100,000 for the initial launch, but I want monthly reports and a detailed financial roadmap. This isn't a game, Lila." Lila nodded, relief flooding her chest. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Ethan nodded again, returning his attention to the computer as if the conversation had ended. But as Lila turned to leave, she heard him murmur, "You have a strong will. I respect that." His words made her pause, but she didn't look back. She returned to the library and dove back into her work. In the following weeks, she contacted philanthropists, met with attorneys to formalize the foundation, and planned the launch event. She also called her mother, who is now in stable recovery, thanks to the treatment Ethan had funded. "Mom, I'm working on something important," Lila said, her voice buzzing with excitement. "The Hope Foundation. It's going to help people like us." Grace laughed softly through the phone. "You make me proud, Lila. But take care of yourself. Don't let this dream consume you." Grace offered to help, and Lila invited her to the launch as the guest of honor. Her mother's support made her feel less alone. She also called Malik, her brother, who was still in med school. "This foundation sounds amazing," he said, bursting with energy. "I can organize a fundraiser at my university." Lila laughed deeply, moved by his enthusiasm. "Just focus on studying, future doctor." "But thank you." The Hope Foundation launch took place at a city conference center with soft lighting and elegantly decorated tables. Lila wore an emerald green dress as she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. Before she sat hundreds of guests, donors, doctors, and families affected by medical debt. Grace sat in the front row, her eyes glowing with pride. Ethan stood at the back, dressed in a dark suit, his gaze fixed on Lila. She took the microphone, her voice strong and clear. "A year ago, my family stood on the edge of devastation. My mother had cancer, and we didn't have the money to save her. I know the feeling of helplessness when you can't protect the people you love. The Hope Foundation ensures no family has to face that choice." The room fell silent, then erupted into applause. Lila spoke about the foundation's mission and the first families they would support. She didn't mention Ethan by name, but her eyes drifted toward him, knowing he was the reason this was even possible. After her speech, a middle-aged woman approached with tears in her eyes. "I'm Sarah," she said. "My daughter Emma has a heart condition. Because of your foundation, we can finally afford her surgery. Thank you." Lila hugged Sarah tightly, feeling more certain of her life's purpose. She looked over at Grace, smiling proudly, and knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. As guests began to leave, Ethan walked up to Lila. "You did well," he said quietly. "I didn't think you could pull off something like this." Lila looked at him, sensing a rare honesty in his tone. "Thank you for funding it. It means more than you know." Ethan nodded, his eyes lingering on her longer than usual. "You're not just a contract, Lila. You're someone with vision." His words rendered her speechless for a moment. She thought of Harlem, and her dream was to help others and her family. The Hope Foundation was the first step in reclaiming herself, and maybe, just maybe, it could be the bridge between her and Ethan. Lila returned to the mansion that night, her heart full of hope, knowing her journey was only beginning. Lila Brooks sat in the library of Ethan Caldwell's mansion, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating her notebook on the Hope Foundation. It had been 2 months since she became Mrs. Caldwell, and in that time, she had found purpose by launching a charity to help families facing medical crises. But her relationship with Ethan, her husband in name, only remained an enigma. Lila, a 24-year-old black woman, raised in the warmth of Harlem, now sensed she was slowly inching closer to the man behind the fortress of power, thanks to an unexpected moment tonight. Earlier that afternoon, Lila received good news from her mother, Grace. Over the phone, her voice was stronger than ever. "I'm being discharged soon, Lila. Thanks to you and your foundation, I have hope again." Lila smiled through tears. "I only did what was right. Mom, just rest. I'll see you soon." Grace chuckled gently. "I'm proud of you, my girl. But be careful with your heart. Don't let that man make you forget who Lila Brooks is." The words made Lila pause. She knew Grace worried about Ethan, who, despite his many acts of support, still kept a distance. She thought of Ethan, of the secret room he once showed her, filled with Eleanor's paintings and family photos with his father, William. That room proved Ethan wasn't entirely cold, but he still kept his heart under lock and key. She remembered the launch of the Hope Foundation when he'd said, "You're not just a contract, Lila. You're someone with vision." That single line had planted something fragile but real inside her, a hope that they could become more than strangers under the same roof. That evening, Ethan came home earlier than usual. He appeared at the library door, his gray suit slightly wrinkled, his blonde hair tousled, a rare, imperfect version of Ethan. "Are you still working?" he asked, his voice low. Lila nodded, pointing to her notebook. "The Hope Foundation. We just helped a family pay for their child's surgery." Ethan stepped inside and sat across from her. He said, "You've done more than I expected." A flicker of surprise in his eyes. Lila smiled, but she didn't stop there. "Ethan, I want to ask you something." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The room upstairs. Why did you show it to me? And why don't you want me to go back?" Ethan stiffened, his eyes darkening. Lila pressed on, her voice steady. "I know about your parents. I know how they died. But I want to understand you, not Ethan Caldwell, the tycoon, but the real you." He was silent for a long time, as if wrestling with something inside. Then he stood and pulled a key from his pocket. "Follow me," he said, his voice husky. Lila followed him upstairs, her heart pounding. Ethan unlocked the secret room. The soft wall sconces lit the photographs and the easel gently. Lila stepped in and immediately sensed this time was different. He wasn't asking her to leave. He pointed to the unfinished seascape on the easel. "My mother started this when I was 8, he said quietly. "She said it was her dream, a place where no one could hurt us. She never finished it." Lila touched the frame, feeling the sorrow in his voice. "And you, do you paint?" Ethan nodded, gaze distant. "I used to, but after she died, I stopped. The painting reminded me of her." Lila turned to him. "And your father? How did he change you?" Ethan looked at a photo of the two of them, his expression conflicted. He built Caldwell Enterprises from nothing, but he trusted the wrong people and invested in failed ventures out of compassion. When the company nearly collapsed, he worked himself to death. "I died of a stroke when I was 22. I had to rebuild it all, and I swore I'd never repeat his mistakes." Lila stepped closer, her voice soft. "Loving people isn't a mistake, Ethan. It's a strength. Your father gave you more than a company, he gave you a heart." Ethan turned away, as if her words struck a buried wound. "A heart makes you weak, Lila. I can't afford that." She gently placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his body. Not weak, human. They stood silently, the room holding emotions Ethan had buried for years. Lila thought of her own family of grace, who survived cancer thanks to her sacrifice. Malik, chasing his dream of becoming a doctor, and James, her father, still seeking redemption. She understood loss, but she had chosen to live with her heart open, and she wanted Ethan to do the same. "Lila," Ethan said, voice rough, "I showed you this room because, I don't know, maybe because you're different. You're not afraid of me. You don't want my money. You want something real." Lila looked at him, her heart thudding. "I want to know you, Ethan, not the CEO, just you." He didn't respond with words, but for the first time his gaze wasn't cold. He locked the door and murmured, "Don't come back here." "But, thank you." Lila nodded, knowing this moment was a turning point. Ethan had let her see the man behind the armor, if only for a moment. She returned to her room thinking of Harlem, her dreams, and the Hope Foundation. She called Malik to share the day's events, leaving the secret room. "I'm proud of you, sis," Malik said. "Your foundation is changing lives." "But Ethan, how is he treating you?" Lila smiled faintly. "He's complicated. but I don't think he's as cold as I thought. Lila lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a quiet hope bloom. Ethan wasn't just the man who shielded her family from loan sharks or funded her foundation. He was a man carrying deep wounds, and maybe, just maybe, she could help him heal, just as he unknowingly was helping her find herself again. Lila Brooks sat in the small office of the Hope Foundation, the glow from her laptop screen illuminating her face as she reviewed assistance applications. It had been 3 months since she became Mrs. Caldwell, and during that time, she had found meaning through the charity she built, helping dozens of families through medical crises. However, her relationship with Ethan Caldwell, her husband by name, only remains a complex journey. Lila, a 24-year-old black woman who grew up in the warmth of Harlem, had felt she was slowly drawing closer to Ethan until one phone call turned everything upside down. Her phone buzzed as Lila prepared for a meeting with donors that morning. David's name, Ethan's assistant, flashed across the screen. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is David," his voice urgent. Mr. Caldwell collapsed at the office. "He's been taken to St. Mary's Hospital. You should come right away." Lila's heart dropped as if the floor had fallen beneath her. "What happened?" she asked, voice shaking. "We're not sure yet, but it may be heart-related. The doctors are checking." Lila rushed out, heart pounding. She thought of Ethan, the cold man who had shielded her family from loan sharks, who founded the Hope Foundation, who once showed her the secret room that held his buried emotions. She remembered last night when he came home late, rubbing his chest as if in pain, but brushing it off when she asked. "Just tired," he'd said. Now she realized it wasn't just fatigue. At the hospital, Lila found David pacing the waiting room, his face tense. "Mrs. Caldwell, he's stable, but the doctors are still running tests," David said. Lila nodded, trying to steady herself. What exactly happened? David explained that Ethan had been in a board meeting, stood up to write something on the whiteboard, and suddenly collapsed. "The paramedics think it might have been a mild heart attack," he added quietly. Lila sat down, a heavy weight pressing on her chest. Heart attack. She remembered the story of Ethan's father, William, who died of a stroke at 52 from stress. Ethan was only 32, yet he could follow the same path. She thought of her mother, Grace, who had survived cancer thanks to Ethan's support. Now she couldn't let Ethan go through this alone, even if they still lived in emotional distance. Dr. Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman with a kind but firm eyes, appeared. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need to speak with you about your husband," she said, leading Lila into a private consultation room. Mr. Caldwell had a mild heart attack, brought on by stress and overwork. He will recover, but he needs profound lifestyle changes. The next one could be far worse if he doesn't slow down. Lila nodded, but the word dangerous echoed in her mind. "Does he have a family history of heart problems?" Lila shared the story about Ethan's father. Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "That explains a lot. You need to make sure he rests and manages his stress." Lila was allowed into the room. Ethan lay in a hospital bed, pale with an IV in his arm. But his blue eyes were alert, tracking her as she entered. "You came?" he asked, his voice weak but tinged with surprise. Lila sat beside him, taking his hand, cold and slightly trembling. "Of course I did. You're my husband," she said firmly. Ethan looked at their intertwined hands, struggling to believe she was there. "My father had this too," Ethan murmured. "It was the beginning of the end. I don't want—" He trailed off, eyes distant. Lila squeezed his hand. "You're not your father, Ethan. You have me. We'll get through this." He looked at her, and she saw actual vulnerability in his eyes for the first time. "I don't know how to stop, Lila. Work is all I've ever had." Lila shook her head. "That's not true. You have me. You have the Hope Foundation. You have a life outside the office." She thought of Harlem, of learning resilience from Grace. She wanted Ethan to learn how to live, not just survive. The doctor said, "You need rest." "And I'm going to make sure you get it," she said, her tone gently firm. Ethan offered a faint smile, the first real one she'd ever seen. "You're terrifying when you want something, Lila," he said. Lila laughed softly. "I learned from the best you." For a moment, the wall between them cracked. Lila stayed at the hospital for 3 days, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, eating hospital food, and fielding his work calls. She told Ethan's staff he was off limits for business. David was shocked. "Mrs. Caldwell, he's never taken a day off." "Well, it's about time," Lila replied. During those days, Lila called Grace and Malik. Grace was worried but proud. "You're doing the right thing, Lila. Help him the way he helped us," she said. Malik over the phone joked, "Say the word if he's stressing you out. I'll fly over and handle it." Lila chuckled, touched by his protective tone. "Just keep studying, future doctor. I've got this." Lila had a quiet but necessary confrontation on the 3rd day with her father. James arrived at the hospital, standing hesitantly at the door to Ethan's room, guilt in his eyes. "Lila, are you okay?" he asked. She led him into the hallway, her voice low. "Dad, I need the truth. Are there any other creditors? Ethan took care of Marcus Reed, but I need to know everything." James lowered his head. "There's a small loan left with another group. I'm sorry, Lila. I didn't think it would get this far." Lila sighed, her heart torn between anger and sorrow. "You need to stop for Mom, for Malik. I'll tell Ethan. But this is the last time." When Ethan was discharged, Lila brought him home to the mansion. He sat on the sofa looking smaller in a wool sweater than his usual suit. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't expect you to stay at the hospital." Lila sat across from him. "We're a team, aren't we? That's what you said." Ethan nodded, his gaze softer than she'd ever seen. "You're right. And Lila, I'll try to change for you." Lila smiled, a flicker of hope rising. She thought of the secret room, the Hope Foundation, and her family. This crisis, though terrifying, had brought them closer. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she was ready. Not just because of a contract, but because of the honest Ethan, the man she was finally beginning to know. Lila Brooks stood in the garden behind Ethan Caldwell's estate, the setting sun casting a golden glow over her simple white dress. It had been 4 months since she became Mrs. Caldwell, and the journey from a cold contract to a real relationship had transformed them both. Lila, a 24-year-old black woman raised in the warmth of Harlem, now stood with a heart full of hope as she prepared for their second wedding. A ceremony not born of obligation, but of love. Ethan's health crisis had brought them closer, and today they would vow to love each other honestly and freely. The garden was warmly decorated, twinkling string lights draped across trees, wildflowers arranged on wooden tables, and a petal-strewn path leading to the altar. Unlike the first lavish church wedding, only close family and dear friends were present at this time, those who truly cared about Lila and Ethan. Her mother, Grace, sat in the front row, her face radiant after a nearly complete recovery from cancer. Her younger brother, Malik, stood beside her looking mature in a blue suit. Her father, James, was also present, his eyes still holding guilt, but now softened with a quiet hope for redemption. Lila thought back on her journey. She remembered her days in Harlem, helping her father at Soul Haven, and listening to her mother's stories about their ancestors. She remembered her dream of becoming a social worker, now alive through the Hope Foundation. She remembered when Ethan opened the door to his secret room, letting her see the man behind the shield, shaped by the loss of his mother, Eleanor, and father, William. And she remembered the 3 days in the hospital when she stayed by Ethan's side, holding his hand, promising she wouldn't leave. Ethan stepped out, wearing a white shirt and simple dress trousers, his blonde hair catching the light. Unlike their first wedding, his blue eyes now held warmth, and his smile was genuine, not for show. He stood at the altar waiting. Lila walked down the aisle with Malik at her side, feeling the quiet strength of her brother's support. "You look beautiful," Malik whispered, his voice thick. Lila squeezed his hand, knowing that his and her mother's presence was the greatest gift she could receive. The ceremony began, officiated by Ethan's longtime friend Thomas. There were no grand declarations, just heartfelt words. Ethan spoke first, his voice low but steady. "Lila, when we started this, I thought it was just a contract. I didn't know what love was, because I feared it would weaken me. But you showed me that love is strength. I promise to love you not only on the easy days, but when we challenge each other. I promise to be your husband, not just on paper but in truth." Tears streamed down Lila's cheeks, but she smiled. Her turn. She looked into Ethan's eyes and said, "Ethan, I entered this marriage for my family, but I stayed for you. You're not perfect, and neither am I, but together we are better. I promise to love all of you, even the parts you try to hide, and I promise to remind you that you're more than your work. You're more than your wealth." When they exchanged rings, Ethan slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. It had belonged to his mother, Eleanor. "My mother would have loved you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Lila clutched his hand, deeply moved by the meaning of his gift. Unlike the cold pact from the first wedding, their kiss was warm and full of promise, lingering beneath the applause of loved ones. The reception flowed effortlessly in the garden, accompanied by soft jazz, a nod to Harlem and Soul Haven. Grace stood and raised a glass, her voice steady and proud. "Lila, you saved this family. But today, I see you've also found your happiness. Ethan, thank you for giving my daughter a chance to love." Lila embraced her mother, feeling that every sacrifice had been worth it. Malik, ever the jokester, followed with his toast. "Ethan, you're the brother-in-law who saved our family. But if you ever hurt my sister, no mercy." Laughter rippled through the guests, including Ethan, who raised his hands in mock surrender. Lila smiled at her brother, recognizing how much he had grown through the storms they'd weathered. James also stood, voice unsteady. "Lila, I'm sorry for pushing you into that contract. Today I'm proud of you for turning it into love. I promise I'll keep trying to make it right." Lila nodded, not quite ready to fully forgive, but she saw his effort, which mattered. She thought of the threats from creditors, now silenced by Ethan's intervention, and felt a weight lift. Her family was safe. As night fell, Lila and Ethan danced under twinkling lights. He pulled her close, whispering, "Thank you, Lila, for not giving up on me." She rested her head on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, the heart she had helped bring back to life. "Thank you for letting me in, Ethan," she replied. After the celebration, they sat on a garden bench, gazing at the stars. Lila reflected on their journey from a cold contract to an actual wedding. She thought of the Hope Foundation, which is now changing lives. She thought of her family finally steady and healing. And she thought of Ethan, the man who once locked his heart away, now holding her hand, ready to build a future. "Lila," Ethan said softly, "I want you to know I love you, not because of the contract, but because you're you." Lila looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. "I love you too, Ethan, and I'll never let you forget that." They kissed beneath the stars, knowing this was their true beginning, not two strangers bound by paper, but two souls who had found one another. Lila Brooks stood before the mirror in her bedroom, her hand gently resting on her growing baby bump. It had been a year since her actual wedding to Ethan Caldwell, and now at 6 months pregnant Lila, a 25-year-old black woman, raised in the warmth of Harlem, felt her heart overflow with joy. She had once entered a cold marriage contract, but now she was preparing for the anniversary gala of the Hope Foundation, a symbol of her dreams, her transformation, and the love she and Ethan had built. Ethan appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her belly, his blue eyes glowing joyfully. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her hair. Lila laughed, leaning into him. "I'm getting bigger, Ethan." "Not beautiful." He shook his head, voice soft. "You're always beautiful, especially when you're carrying our child." She felt the baby kick, and they both chuckled, a quiet, tender moment that once would have seemed impossible. Ethan, once the cold billionaire, was now a loving husband who had learned to balance business and family after his heart scare the year before. Lila thought back on their journey. She remembered Harlem helping her father James at Soul Haven and listening to her mother Grace share stories of their ancestors. She remembered her dream of becoming a social worker, now a reality through the Hope Foundation, which had helped over 200 families afford medical care. She remembered Ethan's secret room, where he first showed her the hurt he carried from losing his mother Eleanor and his father William. And she remembered their garden wedding, where they pledged love not by contract, but by choice. That evening, the Hope Foundation's anniversary gala was held at the city's convention center, transformed into a warm space filled with golden lights and fresh flowers. Wearing a jade green dress, Lila entered with Ethan by her side, hand in hand. The crowd, donors, doctors, and families the foundation had supported, rose in applause. Lila spotted Grace in the front row, now healthy, and volunteering for the foundation. Malik, her younger brother, had flown in from medical school, standing proudly beside their mother. James was there too now, working in one of Ethan's companies, doing his part to make amends. When Lila stepped onto the stage, she took a deep breath, her voice clear. "I stood on the edge of despair a year and a half ago. My mother had cancer. My family was drowning in debt, and I thought I had no way out. I signed a marriage contract, thinking it was a sacrifice. But I found love not only with my husband, but with a mission to help families like mine." The room fell silent, listening. Lila spoke of the families the foundation had saved, like 6-year-old Emma, who had survived heart disease thanks to life-saving surgery. She glanced toward Ethan standing off to the side, his eyes filled with pride. "My husband Ethan taught me that true strength isn't just measured in wealth, but in heart. The Hope Foundation exists because we believe that love can change lives." Lila paused, her hand resting on her belly. "In 5 months, we'll welcome our first child, and our baby will grow up in a world where hope is never out of reach." Applause erupted, and as Lila stepped down, she felt a sense of peace and purpose she had never known. After her speech, Emma and her mother Sarah approached her. "Miss Lila." "I'm all better now," Emma exclaimed, hugging her. Lila knelt, eyes shining. "You're so strong, Emma. Always believe in hope. Okay?" Sarah took Lila's hand, her voice trembling. "You saved my daughter. Thank you." Lila embraced them both, knowing this was why she had fought so hard. Later, Ethan found Lila resting in a quiet corner of the room. "You were incredible tonight," he said, sitting beside her. She leaned into him. "Thank you, Ethan. None of this would exist without you." He shook his head. "You would have found a way, Lila. You always do." She looked at him, feeling the deep, steady love between them. When the gala ended, they returned to the mansion and sat in the garden where they had once vowed their hearts. Ethan pulled a leather-bound book from his pocket and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. He smiled. A journal. You should write our story from contract to love, so our child will know how their parents found each other. Lila opened the book and saw Ethan's handwriting on the first page. For Lila, the woman who saved me. With all my love, Ethan. She wrote the first line. Once upon a time, a desperate girl signed a contract with a cold billionaire. Neither knew they were about to change each other's lives. She leaned into Ethan as the baby kicked. She said, "If it's a girl, let's name her Hope. And if it's a boy, William, after your father." Ethan squeezed her hand, eyes glistening. Perfect. Under the stars, Lila thought of her family, Grace now healthy, Malik soon to be a doctor, James rebuilding himself. She thought of the Hope Foundation and the lives it had saved. And she thought of Ethan, the man who once locked his heart away, now her life partner. Their story had begun as a transaction, but now it was a love story, a legacy of hope. Lila knew challenges lay ahead, parenthood expanding the foundation, but with Ethan by her side, she was ready for everything.